The Jerry Powell podcast is supported by listeners like you who've either spread the word on social media, left reviews on podcasting apps, or have clicked on our donate button on the Jerry Powell website so we can continue to fund each one of these episodes. Welcome to the Jerry Powell podcast. This is Eric Widera.
This is Alex Smith.
And Alex, we got a full house today.
We have a full house today, and we're delighted to welcome Alex Lee to the podcast. She's an epidemiologist and assistant professor of medicine in the UCSF Division of Geriatrics. Welcome to the Jerry Powell podcast, Alex.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And we're delighted to welcome back James Deardorff, who is a geriatrician and research fellow in the UCSF Division of Geriatrics. Welcome back to Jerry Powell, James.
Thanks for having me.
And we're delighted to welcome back Sei Lee, who is a geriatrician and palliative care doc and is professor of medicine in the UCSF Division of Geriatrics. Welcome back, Sei.
Howdy.
So we're going to be talking about prognostication and prognostic indices. But before we jump into that topic, James, I think you have a song request.
Yes, I do. I have requests for Forever Young by Alphaville.
I love it. I actually just went to New Order and Pet Shop Boys. So the fact that you're bringing up synth pop, warms my heart.
Were you alive when this song came out?
Definitely
1982.
Not alive in the 1980s. But yes, you sang Forever Young by Bob Dylan around 3 years ago. And then Eric jokingly started singing this song, and so now it's about time to fulfill Eric's request.
Sei, do you have any comment?
This is, I was thinking that this shows James is a true older soul at heart, even though chronologically he may be a lot younger than me, because this song is near and dear to my heart because this was my first slow dance when I was in, I think it was 9th grade. It was kind of the junior high party. And so this is a song that is kind of burned into my brain.
Yeah, this is definitely, if you grew up in the 80s, this is the slow dancing song. Alex, give us a little bit.
Here we go.
Alphaville.
There is no guitar in the Alphaville version.
That's what I was
No guitar at all. So this is my rendition with generous support from people who've covered it on YouTube.
It is also very high, so I am very curious to see how you're going to hit the notes.
Let's dance in style, let's dance for a while. Heaven can wait, we're only watching the skies. Hoping for the best, but expecting the worst. Are you gonna drop the bomb or not? Let us die young or let us live forever. We don't have the power, but we'll never say never. Sitting in a sand pit, life is a short trip. Music's for the sad man. Can you imagine when this race is won? Turn our golden faces into the sun. Praising our leaders, we're getting in tune. Music's played by the madman. Forever young, I want to be forever young. Want to live forever, forever and ever, forever young. I want to be forever young. Do you really want to live forever, forever young?
That was awesome, Alex.
Well done.
James, why'd you pick this song?
Well, I think we'll be talking about how it might not be possible to live forever. And I mean, also it was German Day in Golden Gate Park yesterday. So
Oh, it was
1980s German synth pop sounds great.
Well, I think, going back, I doubt that me and Sei, while we were slow dancing, well, me and Sei weren't slow dancing together, but The fascinating thing about German synth pop in the 80s, like we dance it, but it's really about nuclear annihilation. Like Forever Young is about the prospect of dying in a nuclear Armageddon, which is like 99 lift balloons.
Oh, that's what it's about? Oh.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Read the lyrics.
Oh, well, here's some from the end. We're going to sing the second verses, and it's so hard to get old without a cause. I don't want to perish like a fading horse. One wonders if there are some translation issues from the original German.
Hoping for the best, but expecting the worst. Are you going to drop the bomb or not?
Oh.
Yeah. I think especially in Germany, where they had such a heavy U.S. military presence, being so close to the Warsaw Pact and East Germany,
99 red balloons also.
Absolutely.
We haven't done, have we done, no, I think we have done 99 red balloons.
But in the
German version, I want to hear Alex.
The 99 Luftballon.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen.
That's not our topic today, is it? I could talk about 80s synth pop all day. By the way, Pet Shop Boys in concert, amazing. Yeah. So we're not going to talk about Pet Shop Boys anyways. We're going to talk about prognostication and prognostic indices. James, I'm going to start with you since you picked Alphaville, and thank you for that. Why is prognosis important when we're thinking about caring for older adults?
Yeah. So I guess prognosis in general is kind of a term for predicted course of disease. And I think people commonly use it to refer to an individual's life expectancy or how long the person has to live. And I think this is a really difficult topic to talk about with patients. And oftentimes, patients and clinicians should be appropriately skeptical about our ability to predict the future, and an individual's life expectancy can change dramatically. But we know from previous studies that a lot of older adults actually want this information, but might not feel comfortable bringing it up. And really providing these estimates of how long a person has to live affects a lot of the decisions we have to make clinically. So if you can think about certain decisions, like continuing to screen for certain cancers like colon cancer or breast cancer, or how strict you should control diabetes or blood pressures. We know that a lot of times with cancer screening, you don't actually get benefits right away, and it can cause potential harms right away. So we want to make sure that we're targeting these interventions to those most likely to benefit. Sei Lee has done a lot of work on a topic of time to benefit. So like for colon cancer, it takes about 10 years before you start to see a mortality benefit for cancer screening. And if you have an older adult who might have a life expectancy in the range of 2 to 3 years, it might not make sense to continue screening for cancer. And that's a difficult decision to make, and providing these estimates can help clinicians and patients with that type of shared decision making.
So maybe it would be helpful as we just think about this, because the topic of time to benefit and thinking about, how does prognosis fit into that? Maybe we can just go around kind of quickly and just mention, what decisions that we think about involve time to benefit. I know there was a huge colonoscopy study that just came out in New England Journal of Medicine. We won't talk about that. But I'm going to throw out, James mentioned colonoscopies, colon cancer screening, which includes Flexig and other forms. Generally, we're looking at a time to benefit of, say you did this study about 10 years?
Yep.
What other decisions? I'm going to turn to Alex. Alex, what other decision? Alex Lee.
Sure. So for diabetes example, a lot of the diabetes prevention that controlling blood sugar works for is for things like preventing chronic kidney disease or dialysis. And those have a very, very long time horizon. Someone who's healthy in their 60s and just got diagnosed with diabetes, yeah, they might benefit if they have a very long life expectancy to prevent that decline in kidney function. But for someone who's already, has significant cardiovascular disease or other comorbidities, they might have a shorter life expectancy. And so the benefit that they would get from lowering their blood sugar from, say, an A1C of 8 to an A1C of 7, that might improve their kidney function if they lived another 20 years. But if they're not going to live another 20 years, then there's no point in giving them the extra medication for lowering their A1C. And so I think that's a great example of how time to benefit is really important in terms of comparing that with the expected time life expectancy that a patient has.
Sei?
Yeah, I think one example would be more intensive blood pressure treatment, and this time to benefit issue I think becomes really important when the treatment leads to immediate risks and then the benefits happen later. And so, for example, for blood pressure treatment, we know that the risks for the blood pressure becoming too low and leading to lightheadedness and sometimes even falls and fractures, we know that is much more likely when you just start a new blood pressure medicine or intensify a blood pressure medicine in the first 30, 60, 90 days. And so there's an immediate risk, but we also know there are delayed benefits, and the delayed benefits of decreased heart failure exacerbations, decreased strokes, and they're so really important benefits, but the benefits are a little bit later. And so that time to benefit, as best as we can tell, is somewhere in the 1 to 2 year range, and we're still kind of working out exactly what that is. And so if somebody's life expectancy is substantially shorter than that, then the chances that they're going to be exposed to all the risks with a low likelihood of getting the benefits makes it that's less likely that we should do that for them. And I would just like to point out one kind of tangent is Alex Smith is one of the people who's done work on how there's a lot of heterogeneity among older adults on how much they want to hear about their own prognosis. And certainly from my experience, there have been patients who, when I have kind of cautiously broached this topic, it's kind of like the floodgates open and they're like, thank God somebody is talking to me about this. My best friend just died. And this is something that they've been thinking about and nobody is wanting to talk to them because everybody is so, and then there are other patients that I've talked to and they're like, I don't really think you know, or anybody can know. And they're not interested in talking about prognosis, but there is this large heterogeneity. And I think it behooves us as clinicians to actively engage with patients and really get a sense of, is this something that they want to talk about, and try to make the best decisions for them given their values and preferences.
Alex Smith, do you got another example?
I'll build on what Sei just said and go with a non-clinical example. And that is when we interviewed a diverse group of 65 older adults who are living with disability in English and Spanish and Cantonese, we found that 2/3 of them wanted to know if their doctor thought that they had less than 5 years left to live. And it was for a whole host of reasons, almost all of which were non-clinical, right? They wanted time to prepare, to get their spiritual house in order, to get right with God, to think about, moving nearer to the grandkids, to get their finances in order, to prepare their wills. It was all about preparation. And I think that's something that is probably underappreciated as we're thinking of, do I disclose prognosis to patients in the context of a clinical encounter? And we're so focused on these clinical decisions and how prognosis is important on clinical decisions. And yet older adults, our patients may want to know for a very different set of reasons. Eric, you're up.
Well, I'm going to actually switch topics and ask Sei, because Sei, there's a website that I heard about called ePrognosis that has a list of time to benefit not from what Alex was talking about, from a clinical decision standpoint. You want to describe what that website is?
Yeah, so this is something that Alex and I have been kind of, working on the side, on the side for the past 10, 12 years. E-Prognosis was started out as just a list of different prognostic indices. So things to predict mortality in hospitalized adults, things to predict mortality in community dwelling adults, things to predict mortality in nursing home residents. And we've been slowly building that out. And really the two things that we were kind of, we felt like really needed to be built out was, number one, focusing on patients with dementia, because it's such a common population. And really, we have good studies to show that the trajectory of decline in dementia is pretty different than almost any other disease. And so we thought kind of focusing specifically on dementia patients was important. And then the other thing that we really wanted to do was to come up with an index that looked at things other than mortality, because older adults, as Alex mentioned, care about a lot of things, and the clinical decision making is probably less than half of what they care about. And so thinking about other things like mobility impairment, the ability to take care of themselves, live independently, those sorts of things, outcomes other than mortality, we thought were really important.
And we'll get to both of those, but can you describe the time to benefit page?
Oh, yeah. So the time to benefit page is trying to make the mortality indexes link more closely to the time to benefit. So we have a list of various interventions like hospice referral, like more intensive treatment for blood pressure, more intensive treatment for diabetes, for dysglycemia, hyperglycemia, statins, bisphosphonates, all of these different preventive medications, which we highlight the time to benefit. And so that if somebody's estimated life expectancy is greater than the time to benefit, then that intervention would be recommended. Whereas if somebody's life expectancy is less than the time to benefit, then that intervention would generally not be recommended.
And Alex Lee, Sei was bringing up prognostic indices and all this stuff. Why use prognostic indices?
One reason to use prognostic indices is really to kind of standardize, prognosis across clinicians. I think there can be a lot of variability across different clinicians, maybe, their experiences, what sort of comorbidities they see. Maybe an endocrinologist has a different opinion about what life expectancy might be compared to a geriatrician, compared to an oncologist. And maybe they are all even seeing the same patient, but they could have different ideas of what that prognosis looks like. So that's one reason. I think also there's been studies that show that clinicians often have a biased view of what prognosis, how long people have to live. I think the more that they feel connected to the patient, it's often that they'll kind of overestimate optimistically the person's life expectancy. And so I think prognostic models are very important when we're doing evidence-based medicine to really kind of standardize the playing field and make it so that these are objective, projections of what someone has left in their life.
Oh, yeah, I got a question for Alex Smith then. Alex, way back when you published a paper in JAMA on prognostic indices with Lindsay Yorman, and the editorial was rather harsh on prognostic indices. Do you remember what they said?
No, it wasn't the editorial. Tom Gill wrote the editorial.
Okay,
he was very kind and supportive, but we did hear from former UCSF faculty member, and I think she was dean at UC Davis at the time, Faith Fitzgerald, who said these prognostic indices, they're the punctilious quantification of the inherently amorphous, right? Like, how can you, it's this attempt to tidy up, systematize, quantify what is inherently unknowable. And we appreciate that criticism, because prognosis, like the weather, is inherently uncertain. There is tremendous amount of uncertainty, not only in these prognostic models, as Alex Lee and James will talk about, as well as uncertainty of whether it applies to that patient who's sitting right in front of you. And yet, our rejoinder would be, well, it's probably better than the clinician's estimate, which, studies have consistently shown are off, right? By as much as a factor of 5, right? Nicholas Christakis' landmark series of studies in this area. Yes, it's imperfect, and we recognize that. And we're always clinically making decisions that are based on imperfect information. And so the idea is that we're reducing as much as we can the uncertainty, acknowledging that it still exists and acknowledging that with our patients.
Well, I'm going to push you on that. Is it like we have a fair amount of certainty? Like I know based on our lyrics that we just did, we are not all going to be forever young. I also know that everybody who is listening to this podcast or who's on this podcast will be dead in 120 years. I feel like what we're often talking about is where our confidence intervals are as far as the likelihood that somebody will survive a particular area. Like, I'm pretty sure everybody's going to make it through this podcast today, but it's around those confidence intervals. Say, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the Hemingway quote about all stories continued long enough end in death, and he is no true storyteller who will keep that from you. Kind of similarly, I've made the remark to various forums to trainees about how, a survival model, if you're going to go out 150 years, the survival model is going to be pretty boring because everyone is going to die. And the only factor that really is going to matter at that stage is going to be age. I think fundamentally, I will say that I think Dr. Fitzgerald's comment has not won the day because increasingly what we're seeing is more and more clinical decisions that are tied to prediction. And so the most common, the two examples that I would talk about are treatment for osteoporosis that hinges on the 10-year risk of fracture, and then treatment for hyperlipidemia that hinges on predicted 10-year cardiovascular events. And so the idea here is that generally the risks of bad things like side effects are pretty constant throughout the population. And then, so if you try to treat people at very low risk of disease, then their risk of the side effects may actually be higher than their risk of avoiding that disease. Whereas if you treat people at high risk of the disease, their chances of benefit are going to be much higher than their chances of side effects. And so this is all about trying to make sure that we are identifying people at high enough risk of the bad thing that we're trying to prevent so that they're more likely to benefit than be harmed by what we're doing to them.
I got a question for you, James. Say just mentioned a couple like FRAX. Like we use, predictive indices all the time. Whether or not to start anticoagulation for atrial fibrillation, CHADS VASC, what's the risk for bleeding, how's bled? There's no huge editorial saying, we can't predict the future when it comes to AFib. Why is it that when we talk about mortality, all of a sudden, we hear these arguments that this is, what was the line again, Alex?
The punctilious quantification of the amorphous.
I don't think anybody ever said that about CHADS VASC.
Yeah, I mean, people have said that I am punctilious.
Yeah, I think you run into these issues with all types of models, and CHADS VASC and kind of 10-year AS or cardiovascular disease risk calculators all can be misleading or miscalibrated in certain subgroups and populations, and they're all prone to these same errors that deal with mortality. I think probably it might just be the gut feeling of you're predicting someone's life expectancy rather than where there's so much. It's difficult to talk about someone's mortality, and so there might just be that kind of knee-jerk reaction to using some of these models. Whereas, even though strokes and heart attacks are also equally can be equally problematic. I think mortality as like the final end path is more sensitive subject.
Mm-hmm. Before Eric gets to the articles, tremendous title from The Onion from 97, World Death Rate Holding Steady at 100%. World Health Organization officials expressed disappointment Monday as the group's finding that despite the enormous efforts of doctors, rescue workers, and other medical health professionals, the global death rate remains constant at 100%. I love The Onion. Okay, that's my interjection.
All right. I'm going to jump to the articles. Let's start off with your article, James. Published in JAMA IM?
Yep.
You did a prediction model for community-dwelling older adults with dementia. Why did you do this?
Yeah, I think for older adults with dementia, we know that the clinical course is highly variable. And if you look at previous kind of population-based studies, the median survival time after diagnosis is really broad and can range based on the study from 3 to 12 years. That's been reported previously. And there have been a few mortality prediction models that have been done in the past. Most of them are dealing with older adults with dementia who are living in the nursing home or have severe dementia. But we know that actually most adults with dementia are living in the community. And this represents a really heterogeneous population that kind of span the disease severity. And a lot of these are older adults with mild to moderate disease. And so just given that there weren't any well-known or well-used models, we decided to create one for specifically this population of those living in the community at home, with most of them had more in the mild to moderate stages.
And just for our listeners, how do you create a prediction model? Like, can you simplify it into, we don't want to get too wonky on this podcast, but what does that process look like?
Yeah, I think so. There is no exact, there's this one model that's going to say, this is the one that predicts mortality. What you really do is you look at a whole bunch of different factors that we kind of know are associated with increased risk of mortality. So age is an obvious one. From previous studies, we know that functional difficulties, so needing help with dressing or bathing is an important risk factor for mortality. And what you do is essentially just look at a lot of these kind of predictors, come up with one through some statistical techniques that seems reasonable based on something that can be used in clinic that's not too large, that has so many variables that it's just really difficult to calculate, and make sure that it performs well. And so once you come up with something that seems pretty reasonable, that is ultimately the model. But we're not saying that this is the only model that would predict mortality. We're just saying these are some of the factors that are likely to be associated with increased risk of mortality and may be helpful for basing these predictions.
I'll just interject to say, it's often said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think that's helpful to keep in mind that, nothing is perfect. Like, there is so much randomness in all of these outcomes that, no model is going to be perfect, but it's a matter of creating something that's going to be useful for whatever decision it's going to be used for, and convenient also for the people who are going to be using it, both in terms of how they can do it practically, but also what needs to be assessed to go into the model, whether that's age or disabilities or comorbidities.
There's a lot of association around socioeconomic status and social determinants of health. Should that be part of prognostic indices?
Well, I think this is it's a very important issue that I think, today really needs to be discussed and thought about very seriously. I think we've seen a clear backlash among medicine in terms of using race specifically in these prognostic models, for good reason, that, you would actually change some clinical decisions based on race alone, if that's being, pushing the model one way or the other, that would make a clinical decision different. But I think socioeconomic status, a lot of those indicators are very closely tied to race. And so, it could be that introducing some socioeconomic status predictors, say zip code, if you have a highly segregated city, you're basically going to have that zip code could actually just basically be a proxy or something that's essentially capturing the Black race, for example. So I think it needs to be done sensitively. I think obviously we know that people who live in poverty or, have had difficult circumstances during their lives, they're often more likely to have a shorter lifespan. And even, with a similar comorbidity level, they might still have a shorter lifespan. So that's certainly something to be considered, but we don't want to have kind of a feedback loop whereby, people who are living in difficult circumstances are then kind of, in a sense, discriminated against in medicine and given less intensive treatments that might actually benefit them. So I think it's something that has to be done very, very carefully and thoughtfully in terms of what you think the inputs you're using, like zip code, are actually capturing, and then also what kind of decisions are going to be made from that model that we may or may not want socioeconomic status to play into those.
So you've thought about this a lot. I mean, I can imagine that you create a prognostic indice that people may use, let's say for colon cancer screening. You don't want that then to worsen disparities of care. What are your thoughts?
Oh boy, this is such a mess. It's meaning I don't have any good answers. I think this is incredibly hard. And kind of the thing that I keep coming back to was an article I read about how this was in the legal space when people were talking about parole and using recidivism rate as in the prediction model for parole. And then there was a lawsuit because they were saying you're using gender, and gender is a protected characteristic. And so you can't use gender to make this parole decisions. And what they found was that if you don't use gender, the black and white truth of the matter is women are much less likely to recommit crimes than men. And isn't that an important and valid reason to include a factor like gender in decisions about parole? And so they said when they decided not to include gender, what it ended up doing was keeping women who are very unlikely to recommit crimes in prison longer, and then letting men who were more likely to recommit crimes out earlier because they were not allowed to use gender. And so I think about this in terms of medicine, in that if I do believe that somebody who has been historically marginalized and has had all of these additional, poor food, no physical environment for exercise, next to pollution, if that means that they're more likely to die sooner, does that mean that they should not get screening? On some level, if I feel like all of those things are truly unchangeable, then I think the pragmatic or empiric answer would probably be yes. But the problem is I have no idea if those things are truly unchangeable. So all of this is to say, I don't know what the right answer is. But I do think that whenever we develop these models, we try to think through these questions. And we try to stay away from things that would exacerbate or perpetuate disparities, which I think everyone can agree are things that we should try to minimize. So I feel like I've talked myself into circles. I don't know what to do. I do think that we try to think about this, and we try to, when we decide which factors to incorporate and which factors to not incorporate, we try to balance all of these different considerations. But I think it's just really, really, these are thorny topics, and I don't have any good answers.
Yeah, I just want to throw out too, we did a Updates in ID and Nephrology Jerry Powell podcast. And I think it was Rashida Hall was talking about thinking about how to think about EGFR and where we are with race-based algorithms for EGFR versus thinking about newer calculators. So I encourage all of our listeners to listen to that podcast as well. Okay, I'm going to switch back to topics. I know we could go on for this. James, how good was your calculator or indice?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different ways that you can measure model performance, and I don't need to get into much of the details. A lot of it's related to the two main ones are discrimination and calibration, and essentially just how closely the model's predicted event probability matches the observed probability, and whether or not you can kind of correctly identify those who do and do not die during follow-up. And so the model was pretty good compared to previous ones. We calculated something called the integrated area under the receiver operating characteristic curve, and it was 0.75, which is a pretty reasonable metric. And then on calibration, the observed probabilities seem to align fairly well with the model's predicted probabilities. So we felt pretty good that our model did a pretty good job at predicting mortality from 1 to 10 years for these older adults. And we also used another cohort to validate the model just to make sure that it also applied to other individuals. And that seemed to perform pretty well.
Yeah, just to put this in context, what does an IAUC of 0.75 mean for our listeners? Ken Kavinsky put it succinctly for us the other day when he said, Louise Walters, who's been on this podcast, she has a prognostic model for hospitalized older adults, and she had same 0.75, right, was her AUC. And so Ken Kavinsky liked to explain it as, well, if 0.5 is a coin flip, which is pretty useless clinically, right? And 100% would be perfection. 0.75 means it's halfway between useless and perfection.
Does anybody know how does that compare to other prognostic indices that we use, like Chad's VASC or FRAX or any of that?
I would say it's fairly similar to many indices that we use. I think most indices, pragmatically, that are used in clinical medicine are in the points around 0.75, 0.7 to 0.8 range. Alex Lee, were you about to say something?
No, I think that's correct. I think it's good. I think it's hard to get, in some sense, models that do too well, like above 0.9, you kind of question, like, what exactly are they predicting? Is it even a useful model if you can really tell that well, in a sense?
And Alex, you did another study published in JAGS, but you didn't look at mortality, right? You looked at disability risk. Why did you do your study?
Well, so our model is what we're calling a comprehensive prognostic index. So it predicts both, actually 3 outcomes. It predicts mortality, it predicts time to walking disability, so time until someone can't walk across a room, and time to ADL disability. And so this is really important because, a lot of indices predict mortality in different populations, but there's very few that predict disability. There's some that predict disability for patients with stroke or other, very serious diseases, but not a model that predicts in the general population of older adults. And this is important because a lot of older adults actually care more about their functional abilities than their time to death. And I think that's largely because it influences so much about their quality of life and, how independent they feel in their life, whether they're still able to go out and take their grandchildren on a walk, or if they, need help cooking dinner every night, things like that. That really changed kind of their life circumstances. And so we wanted to create a model that's going to reflect that sort of risk and what it also means for their families and financial decisions. Because I think a lot of times, when someone develops significant disabilities, they need to either, move into an assisted living home or get in-home supportive services. And so, it's important for a wide range of both health and non-health related decisions that older adults need information on. And again, so this is a gap in the literature that we thought we could help out with. So that's why we did the paper.
And since we are getting close to the hour, how good was this index?
So this index, it did pretty well for mortality, similarly about 0.7, 0.72 for mortality. It wasn't quite as good for disability and walking disability. And we think that's, I think it's a harder outcome to predict in some sense. it's based on self-report. So it could be that, it's something that maybe varies over time a little bit, or, we don't have perfect reporting because we do have, this is based on a survey that's done every 2 years. So maybe, it happened at some point and then, I don't know, people can go back and forth on disability. So it's something it kind of wavers more, and it's not quite as yes or no. Like mortality is very binary. You're either dead or you're alive. Whereas being able to walk across the room, well, maybe you can do it some days, but not all. Maybe you need your walker sometimes, but not always, things like that. So I think it's just they're just harder outcomes to predict. So the discrimination statistics was more like in the 0.6 to 0.7 range, which is lower, but still useful, we believe.
And both of these indices are on ePrognosis now, right?
Correct.
How do you imagine clinicians actually using this? Either one of these indices. Alex?
Yeah, so I think this could be used in a variety of circumstances. Again, I think there's some clinical treatment decisions that also rest on, how good we believe someone's functioning to be. For example, with diabetes treatment, we're really concerned whether they have some IADLs or ADLs that might make them at higher risk of hypoglycemia and have less likelihood to benefit from intensive glycemic treatment. So, I think it could be used to inform some of those treatment decisions, but I think it could also be used just generally, if a patient's kind of wondering, like, again, what's my prognosis in a bigger sense, not just mortality, but, what do you think my life is going to look like in 5 years? Am I going to, be living independently, or am I not? Am I going to need help with getting dressed, or am I not? Things like that, where I think, patients might want to know this information. And so I think this will be very helpful for clinicians for those sorts of circumstances.
Yeah, I really like in the discussion of your paper how you talk about these two different patients. You name them, hypothetical patients, Mark and Nancy, and how they make very different decisions about where they choose to live because of their future risk of disability, mobility disability, and mortality. One chooses senior living, and I think the other chooses, I don't remember. But this is how it could, impact the life choices that older adults are making.
Right. Yeah, I mean, maybe someone shouldn't be continuing to live in a 2-story house by themselves, for example, if you think they're going to be at high risk of walking disability. Whereas, someone who's fairly low risk of walking disability, but is quite old and maybe has a fairly high risk of death, yeah, they're fine where they are. And you don't really need to change things. So again, it can make big differences in life decisions.
And James, how do you think people should be using these indices?
Yeah, I think I would echo the same kind of comments. And yeah, I think in the clinic, really as clinicians, we should be empowered to ask some of those questions, like how much do you want to know about the likely course of this illness? Because as Sei was saying earlier, there's a really wide range in terms of what people want to know, but and how comfortable they are asking. And so some people really want this information, and it can help frame a lot of the screening and treatment decisions that we've talked about over the last hour. And so just using in that context of a trusted clinician-patient relationship and seeing how we can better improve shared decision-making.
I was going to say, I see Alex have his put on his guitar, so I know our time is limited. But
it's like the Academy Awards. Once he's going to start playing over your voice.
I feel the hook about to come out. But I was going to say that I think one of the ways that these indices are really helpful is it almost allows clinicians to not be the bearer of bad news, but have the news be more kind of one step removed. If the clinician has a good relationship with this patient, but really doesn't want to be the person saying, you're kind of diseases and you've fallen a couple of times. This makes me worried about what's coming up. I think talking about, there's this study that shows that for people like you, there are some bad things that can happen in the future. Maybe it's about time that we start talking about some of these things. It allows that relationship. It allows the clinician to not be the bad guy or the bearer of bad news. And I think that may be another way that this work could be helpful.
Yeah. Almost like in the song, hoping for the best, but expecting the worst. Are you going to drop the bomb or not?
Maybe that's where our palliative care language came from. Here we thought that, whoever wrote that seminal article, Bob Arnold, whoever it was, they just made it up. No, they were listening to Alphaville, 80s
Alphaville.
synth pop,
It all
and we're
comes back to
inspired.
Alphaville.
Bob
It
is the
all
right
comes
generation.
down to synth pop. That is the underlying communication skills training program. You just got to listen to a lot of synth pop.
That's right. Here's a little bit more. Some are like water and some are like heat. Some are a melody and some are the beat. Sooner or later, they all will be gone. Why don't they stay young? It's so hard to get old without a cause. I don't want to perish like a fading horse. Youth's like diamonds in the sun, and diamonds are forever. Forever young, I want to be forever young. Do you really want to live forever, forever and ever? Forever young, I want to be forever young. Do you really want to live forever, forever young?
Alex, I loved how you brought in the melancholy into that song. It's just, yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine like a young Sei and a young Eric rocking back and forth. Like eighth
Just
grade.
trying not to step on feet is what I was thinking. Just don't do that. Just
Yeah.
supposed to
Alphaville.
lead, don't
Love
step
it.
on feet.
James, Alex, thanks for joining us. Sei, it's always great to have you on.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having
Thank
us.
you.
Excellent song too, James. Thank you to all of our listeners for your support. If you have a second, follow us on YouTube. We're trying to get those numbers up. And have a great night, everybody. And a special thank you to all of our listeners who've donated $250 or more to the Jerry Powell podcast.
Including Meg Walhagen, Thomas Quinn, Rochelle Bernacki, Louise Aronson, James Tulsky, Arden O'Donnell, Mike Steinman, Marianne Forcia, Ashok Krishnaswamy, Nancy Lundeberg, Gail Cooney, David Schiffeling, Cheryl Phillips, Jessica Ng, Harry Hahn, Elizabeth Chung, Kathy Foley, Lloyd Woolstat, Christine Ritchie, Matthew Schuster, Daryl Owens, Susan Nelson, Christopher Heck, Lindsay Yorman, Mo Rizawi, Sue Borson. Thank you very much.